All right, everyone. Well, thanks for taking time out of your day and welcome to the webinar by the Build a Whole Venture Design Lab. So this is the second of a two-part webinar that, as I mentioned last time, we've titled it provocatively, very intentionally, How Lean Startup Plus Patient Capital Sets Impact Ventures Up to Fail and What to Do About It. And again, the provocative title had an intent behind it. We weren't just trying to be provocative, but it was really meant to jolt, if you will, the impact sector out of what feels like an autopilot mode that's developed around venture building, and one that from any hand-to-heart evaluation, it's just not working. I mean, we're sitting at really near zero success rates on ventures. And the focus of the webinar is to help people understand that the venture playbook used by VCs, kind of the lean startup playbook, which is the one that the impact sector has almost universally embraced, it just doesn't work when the goal is to create scaled, lasting commercial solutions to big problems. And that's because the financial constraints you're working under are just completely different. So last week, we unpacked the financial implications of the lean startup, what we call kind of the search and discovery approach, and the why and how it sets ventures where profitability is the end goal up for failure, and how it's particularly disastrous in an impact venture case. And then we explain how combining it with patient or catalytic capital is actually just making it worse. It's not helping the problem. So today we're going to help answer the problems we highlighted, and we're going to overview a new innovation method. We call it Fit Startup, and it's designed for those building for enduring scalable profitability. Since we've got some new faces today, I'm going to do a quick little repeat of an intro and an overview of last week as well when we kick off. So for those who don't know me, my name is Eric Smanis. I've got two hats. I'm co-director of the lab, and I'll tell you a bit more about it shortly. I'm also founder of a venture design firm called Half Solved, and our name kind of tips its hat to that engineering saying that a problem well defined is a problem half solved. And over the past 30 years, the problem I've been trying to solve is that of innovating new market-creating ventures profitably. And that's the key word. And ones that can solve big societal challenges. So I was drawn into this space when I was working on my MBA back in the late 90s, when bottom of the pyramid concept was bubbling up by C.K. Prahlad and Stu Hart. It led to a stint in a new venture team at Monsanto that was focused on getting profitable solutions to smallholder farmers. That transitioned into a doctoral program in strategy at Cornell, where I was focused on solving this challenge of profitably creating market-creating ventures. And during and afterwards, I ran a lab at Cornell where we were building ventures and testing a methodology in field with just a number of organizations. We were at DuPont, SC Johnson, Procter & Gamble, Sightsavers. And that turned into co-founding a venture incubation company where we just had the fortune, really, to guide over probably it's like a couple dozen impact ventures for clients like we had Barclays, BMW UK, Pearson, Unilever, Disney, Mars, as well as a number of clean tech startups that were all focused on emerging markets. And through all of that, I believe we've defined the problem extremely well. We've unpacked the science, I would say, behind profitable venture creation. And we've developed this methodology that I just believe fully, can create a step change in success rates. And just to be clear, we reached this point because we led, guided, and really kind of supported just a number of ventures that we ended up shuttering because they failed. And we did that for about a decade before we really started to turn things around. So, what we're sharing today isn't something that was just born of like an initial flash of brilliance, but it's been a pretty hard-earned journey, I'll say. And Half Solved in the lab were both created to put this science and practice into the world. All right. So just again, one brief comment about the lab. So this lab, the Built a Whole Venture Design Lab, it's a partnership between Half Solved, the Center for Sustainable Global Enterprise at Cornell, and INCOSE. INCOSE is the International Council on Systems Engineering. It's the professional body for systems engineering. It's a partner because the methodology is based in just core systems engineering principles and practices. And the mission of the lab is to advance and disseminate kind of the science and the methodology. And we've got two main thrusts. We've got a training thrust, doing workshops, courses, webinars like this one that introduce people to the method. We're kicking off a course at Cornell in the engineering school in the fall, focused on robust venture design using this method. And then we also have this applied part where we do applied research projects. And the one I'll highlight is with the MIT Alumni Angels Network. We're working with them to take this building methodology and flip it around and use it as a venture screening and due diligence tool. Okay. Oops, sorry. So there's going to be three of us tag teaming the session today. So in addition to me, there's Patrick, the other co-director of the lab and Household CEO. And we're fortunate to have Teodora Berkova join us today. I had the pleasure of working with her almost a decade ago, scarily enough, when she was running an impact incubator inside the education company Pearson. Since then, she's moved on to Amazon Web Services. We asked her to join us as she's been engaged with impact ventures from just a lot of different institutional perspectives. So she has just a very, like a holistic understanding and kind of seen a lot of the development and evolution of the space. I'm going to hand off to Patrick here in just a sec, and I'll let him give a proper introduction. And the same with Teodora a little bit later in the session when we bring her in. And quick note on process, just again, given the challenge of interacting on a webinar, we just asked that if you have a question or comment, please use the chat. Patrick's going to be keeping an eye on it, and if there's something that we can jump in and address, we will. If it's something that will require a little bit more time, we're going to have some discussion time, hopefully at the end. And whatever we don't get to today, we'll definitely circle back and do our best to write a follow-up kind of a post around it. Okay, well, with that, Patrick, let me go ahead and hand it off to you.
Great. Thank you, Eric. Just a quick background on myself. As Eric said, I'm also the co-director of the Built to Hold Venture Design Lab and CEO of Half Solved. My background is really originally as a software engineer, but then I spent most of my career working on early stage innovations, particularly in the impact space. In terms of impact work, a lot of that was early with Eric, and as we were working on those base of the pyramid ventures that he talked about earlier, as well as founding my own startups or helping to run startups. But I also spent a number of years doing leading early stage innovation efforts, early stage products at companies like Facebook, Automatic, and Rockwell International. So a lot of what we've developed here, I've seen its applicability in two domains, both in the corporate innovation space, facing a number of challenges in terms of the current venture building paradigm that everybody is using, is obviously also in the social impact space and the impact space overall. So excited to be here, excited to be talking about this topic again. I'm going to do a recap right now. So we'll start with a recap. I'll give you a little teaser into what's coming up. Eric's going to jump in next. We're going to talk with Teodora, and then we're going to close out with a case study that showcases how you can already use some of these concepts here today to do some venture evaluation. So that's the overall arc that we'll be following. Just briefly on last week. So, we dove into this core problem. And by last week, I really mean 2 weeks ago during the first session. And that problem was that innovators building ventures to solve big societal problems are applying a method built on an entirely different game. And that game is really about maximizing valuations for exits. It's not about impact. It's not even necessarily, most of the time, even about commercial viability. And the fact that we're applying that method is setting up the ventures we're building to fail. So today, instead, we're going to dive into how to address this problem, the solution. We're going to use 3 pillars of robust venture design and all of this is based on research and science, as Eric said. It's initially developed at Cornell University and then applied to dozens of build-to-hold ventures across both impact-focused and corporate innovation efforts over the past decade plus. So that's what we'll spend on today. Eric, you want to go ahead? So again, we'll start with a recap of the problem. So we kicked off the last session by highlighting that what we're talking about, what we are facing, is what we call a market creation challenge, where we're trying to bring new functionality into people's lives that didn't exist before, or to solve persistent problems that they face. There are 2 key points that we focused on here. The first is that for every new market, a cost of value barrier exists, a cost of value barrier. And that is keeping the new market from that cost of value barrier is keeping the new market from already existing. And at its core is this equation. the unit costs of the venture exceed the value that customers get from it. The unit costs exceed the customer value, that's when the barrier exists. And two, the second part is that the barrier sits in what we have identified as the default core business architecture for a market. Now, as a recap, the core business architecture of a market is the DNA of the market or industry, and it's shared by all firms operating the market or industry. It's a bundle of strategies that define the basic shape of the product, the operations in the market. It's why GM, Ford, Stellantis, and all other auto companies more or less look alike if you zoom out far enough. The key things, a couple other key things it does, it sets a cost and value curve for the industry. This is a ceiling on how much value can be created within the industry and a floor on how much things can cost on a unit basis. It's why, despite different business models, auto companies' gross margins and net profit margins are remarkably similar across the industry. And just finally, a reminder on the phrase default. So we define default as a particular phenomenon that happens in venture building. So a default core business architecture comes into play when we're unknowingly or unintentionally import a business architecture, often from an analog of the core functionality we want to build. It's like, we're like the Uber of lawnmowers, unintentionally often imports a core business architecture. Or inadvertently from customer research, we set some bounds by saying, hey, that dangerous kerosene lamp that kids are using, let's replace that with something safer. You immediately, unintentionally start bring in these strategies that are defined really for a very different use case, but you bring them into the new domain and therefore constrain what you're capable of doing. Move on. We also covered how lean startup, which is really the dominant venture building paradigm of today, whether or not you use the phrase lean startup or not, you're following a lot of these processes. And this is often, the concept of, learning live in market. You can't know what customers want, so you go out and you test for them. And I'll just touch briefly on these topics. I encourage you to review the recording of the last session if you want more detail. But essentially, lean startup central feature of searching and learning by experimenting and again pivoting live in market has two profound impacts on your venture creation success. The first is that it has resulted in an extremely low probability of success, particularly if you're looking for a self-sustaining, i.e., a profitable venture. The success rate is in the low single digits. It's it's a very poor success rate. The other, and on the right of this diagram, you'll see the key drivers that create this low success rate. How open-ended idea generation, anchoring on customer needs, optimizing products for customers, not the business. These all create these drivers that cause the low probability of success. Again, I really encourage you, if you haven't seen the last session, to check it out. The second impact, the second driver it creates is an extremely long and costly validation timelines. It's more than 10 years to get to profitability if you never get there at all. Meanwhile, you're facing losses of over 40% of revenue along the way. It's extremely costly. And again, you can see the drivers on the right. In this case, it's open-ended experimentation again, but the concept of testing, learning, and pivoting live in market, which is an extremely expensive process to do. Go ahead. So given these outcomes, we talked about, well, why has lean startup become so ubiquitous? Like, why is it everybody uses it and everybody talks about it? Well, it's proven extremely effective in two areas. The first, I would say, arguably, is the one that really has driven most of us to pay attention to it and to think about following it, is that it's a core part of the venture capital investment strategy. And note I said investment strategy there, not innovation strategy. So by investing a large number of ventures combined with what we call their get out of jail free ability to exit, this is how they capture what they call future potential profits, not actual profits. VC funds can make incredible returns without ventures ever achieving profitability. And this is, lean startup helps push this all along. It really solves for some of the key metrics that a venture capital fund needs to get that one or two blockbuster exits that are going to pay back their fund. Meanwhile, most of the other ventures have failed or burnt out. The other area where it's like it does really well actually also is incremental product innovation. You see this example of the milkshake that you probably, if you've read any of the literature around this, it's like, what job did you hire a milkshake to do? The milkshake exists inside of an already viable core business architecture. So when there already exists a valuable core business architecture that can provide you guardrails, lean startup can be a good way to do incremental product innovation. Go ahead. But for ventures that are meant to create a real sustained impact in the world, and this approach is just disastrous. Teams can get locked into a flawed core business architecture. It creates it essentially puts you in a path in a place where there's no path to profitability. Again, it's really built for a different game than trying to build something to hold or build something that's going to have an enduring impact. It's not meant to solve it. But worse, is supported by patient capital. The time value of money makes this issues compound. It quickly destroys the possibility of delivering commercial returns, which cuts off access to sustainable commercial capital. And ultimately, it cuts off your ability to deliver impact at scale. The path just becomes closed off rapidly. Go ahead. So in closing off the summary, if you're building or investing to create enduring commercial solutions at scale, the innovation method has got to be different. You got to have something that's going to counteract these forces or do the opposite of what's done in lean startup. It needs to drive up success rate. It needs to drive down the time it takes to validate that success. And it needs to drive down the amount of money you need to spend in validating that success. And you'll see here again, just a reminder that, again, it's not just, people focused in the impact space that suffer from this. Anybody that can't just use that get out of jail free card or isn't, working in a place where guardrails already exist, they're all facing this problem. And so that's what we're going to jump into now. I'm going to hand off to Eric. Again, the result of more than a decade of applied research and hands-on venture building is focused on solving for these three critical parameters. What's a process or what's an approach that enables you to drive up success rates, drive down validation time, drive down validation cash? Over to you, Eric.
Awesome. Thanks, Patrick. Okay, well, perfect place for us to pick up. So let's dig into, and this is what we're calling kind of this new science in practice. And I just want to really make this clear. What we say, a new science, I really mean that in the strong sense of the term. This isn't about applying kind of the search and discovery process more rigorously. So we're not spending more time and effort doing design thinking and customer discovery. We're spending more time and effort on the business model canvas. It's this classic lean startup tool. What we're going to talk about really flips lean on its head. I liken it to the Copernican revolution. I mean, we're going to be telling you the sun doesn't revolve around the earth here. And the big shift in this new way of innovating ventures is that it treats positive NPV, a measure of profit that considers risk and time value money, as what we call the objective function. Patrick talked about this as something that was missing in the lean approach, which led to suboptimal solutions. It's the North Star that dictates where you put your energy. And as we talked about last week when we dug into the problem of patient capital, the three big financial parameters that drive positive NPV are probability of success, validation time, and validation cash going out. And number one is bolded because it is the most critical of these three. And that's because it has a big hand in the other two. So the takeaway here is that this new science, it designed ventures to have a step change in performance by asking and solving very different questions than lean, targeting different problems, and out of necessity, just using a very different set of tools. All right. So we call the new science and practice fit startup. It's anchored around two core objectives and three principles. And they're all centered around those three main parameters for positive NPV. And the name fit, as you're going to see, it's an acronym derived from the three principles. So objective one is that you design your core product idea for robustness, not the customer. And by robustness, we mean your venture can absorb and withstand uncertainty in cost and demand. So of course, the customer is part of that robustness equation, but there's a lot more that the product idea has to solve for. So why robustness? Why is such the focus? One is because it's the biggest determinant of probability of success at launch. The more robust the venture, the higher the probability that you can take on these unexpected costs and unexpected shifts in demand. And as we said, it then also has this big knock-on effect on validation time and cost. So objective 2 is to pivot on paper, not in market. And that creates the imperative to design in such a way that you can prove the venture works before launching something into market. And why, again, this focus? It's because making big changes in field is, as research shows, it's literally 1,000 times more costly and time consuming than when you do it on paper. Systems engineering just is unequivocal on this. Learning and experimenting live in market and with real built stuff is the most expensive and time-consuming way to do any learning. So those 2 objectives are supported by 3 principles of Fit Startup. So I'm going to do a quick review of them here, but I'll add just a little bit of additional detail on subsequent slides. So principle 1, we call it fortify financial vital signs. It's about designing your venture to drive up 2 key metrics: customer ROI and your margin of safety. They are literally the foundation of your venture's robustness. But to design a venture with these strong vitals, we've got to design out what we call structural profit barriers. That's in practice 2. So these profit barriers, they are the source of that cost to value barrier that Patrick mentioned, that ultimately stands in the way of there being a commercially viable solution to a problem. So practice 2, or principle 2, is what finds them and engineers around them. But to come up with a solution that gets around all the profit barriers in the most robust way, and to be able to evaluate it, you've got to triangulate and use testable logic. Because if you're not really clear about the science behind the problem you're solving and the science behind your solution, you can't test and pivot on paper. So that's principle 3. So to summarize, the testable logic is the basis of robust strategies, which are then needed to circumvent structural profit barriers, which, once you circumvent those, is what generates these strong customer ROI and margin of safety. So let me just go through each one of these just with a little bit of extra detail. So practice 1, fortify financial vital signs. So ultimately, the probability that your venture design is profitable at launch is driven by these 2 numbers. First one's customer ROI. So it is the spread between the high end of the customer willingness to pay and the low end of the absolute value created for the customer by the solution. So a big customer ROI can absorb a lot of lower than anticipated, we call it efficacy of your product. In other words, if your product actually creates less value than you thought it might otherwise. It's also the biggest driver of how many customers buy and how fast they convert. So it's got just enormous impact on cash coming in. And sorry, I'll put this up here. And so what's a good target number? Well, it's kind of the usual, the bigger, the better. But research shows that for low ticket, products, a customer ROI of 50% is motivating to drive adoption. For high ticket price, you need to be in the 300 to 1,000% range. The second number is this margin of safety. So it's the spread between your high-end estimate of full unit costs. And when we say full unit cost, we mean it includes your cost of capital and the low end of the customer willingness to pay. So the margin of safety, that's what now absorbs all those higher than expected costs, as well as all those the unexpected ones, the unknown unknowns, so to speak. And the same goes here. Obviously, kind of the higher the margin of safety, the better. But the reference point we always keep in mind is 60%, and that's because it's the average cost overrun for big projects. And just to kind of make this feel real, we ran kind of backcast and estimated what Airbnb's financial vitals were at launch. And just to be clear, this is from the perspective of the host, who was actually the main customer that Airbnb's founders were solving for. And Airbnb, we chose them because they are a rare, success story in the lean startup space. They grew explosively from launch and was basically cash flow positive from operation from the start. They had accounting losses and were spending to grow, but they were profitable on a full unit cost basis. So when we did this calculation, we treated a unit of product as a 7-night stay and the average revenue it could generate, which is a proxy for the value the host is getting. And then we estimated the willingness to pay by looking at how many months of a mortgage payment could be covered. And then we extracted full unit costs by looking at Airbnb's older P&Ls. And you can see here what we got: customer ROI of 116% and a margin of safety of 133%. I know the ROI may sound low, kind of given those targets we just discussed, but keep in mind in this case, the host isn't paying up front and putting any money at risk, which is where kind of those targets came from. So in this case, that 50% benchmark would be the right one to use. So looking at these two numbers, you can really see why they were so successful at launch and didn't have to go searching for a profitable business model. All right. So this key principle number 2 about innovating around structural profit barriers. So what do we mean by that? These structural profit barriers, they are these deep constraints in what Patrick described as a default core business architecture. Kind of that existing idea that innovators just naturally gravitate to. The solar lanterns to solve for the dangers of using kerosene lanterns, a fortified packaged food to solve for problems of nutrient deficiency. These were some of the examples we ran through in the previous session. But is these constraints that are suppressing customer value and driving up cost. And that's where we are getting this cost to value barrier, such that the cost of making, selling, delivering, getting paid for, and hanging on to customers exceeds the value that we can actually generate. And the key point is that the ability to generate these big customer ROIs and margins of safety, it comes from circumventing and eliminating these barriers. It doesn't come from optimizing them. And just to bring this concept to life as well, I'm going to use an example that I think is just near and dear to everyone's hearts in the impact sector, and that's microfinance. It's probably like the biggest success story, and certainly one of the few since then time. But I think it's just really poorly understood why it was successful. And the reason is because it circumvented structural profit barriers that made the conventional lending model unprofitable when it was directed at smallholder farmers and petty traders. So let's just talk about one of those structural profit barriers, and it's one of the top 3 most important ones that we'll discuss later. So the conventional business architecture for lending to a small business involves due diligence. It's how you evaluate risk and minimize costly defaults. And to assess risk for a conventional small business, a loan agent, they turn to FICO scores, they'll review tax returns. So it's pretty quick, efficient. But when you look at petty traders and smallholder farmers, well, they have no credit footprint. They don't have FICO scores. They have no tax returns. So if you're going to do diligence in their case, it suddenly becomes really time intensive and costly, because you're going to have to literally go out and visit the person. You got to look at the business in order to make any informed decision about whether or not they can pay you back. And to make matters worse, they only need $200 loan. So the cost of that due diligence just drives up the cost of the loan to the point that it's just going to eat up all of the additional income a petty trader or a small farmer could earn. Microfinance famously circumvented that problem. And what they did is they eliminated the need for due diligence altogether by using this, calling it like a peer mechanism, using peers to generate pressure and support on individuals so that we drive down their chance of them actually defaulting. All right, let's do principle number 3, and that's triangulate using testable logic. So by triangulate, what we're just referring to here is that you're optimizing that idea to best solve for all of these profit barriers. And by using testable logic, we mean that the strategies that you're developing to solve the barriers, they can be evaluated through scientific reasoning. So this person here is testing an idea, how to fly, that there is no testable logic. It uses kind of a very classic design thinking way of brainstorming solutions of like, how might we do this? But the only way you're going to evaluate whether you can fly is by mimicking, is by strapping on your wings and just getting out there and trying. And we literally did this for about 1,000 years and we got nowhere. And then Bernoulli, famously developed the science of lift and unpacked kind of the variables that govern whether or not something is capable of flying. Now we have testable logic. So the beauty of being able to explain how something works scientifically is that you can now evaluate the quality of your strategies just through reasoning. You can also now model the solution with high fidelity. And high fidelity means you can really capture how something works. And if you can model in high fidelity, it means you can actually put some credible numbers and values to it. In our case, for the customer ROI, for the margin of safety. And that in turn gives you the ability now to stress test solutions and spot big risks. And if you can do that, we hit the big one. We can pivot finally on paper. So similarly here, let me give you an example. I'm gonna go back again to microfinance, just build off of that one. And so let's assume here that we're gonna start this already coming into this with that peer group strategy that we talked about for due diligence. And our focus now is on the second big structural profit barrier, one that would suppress customer value. So our testable train of logic, would look something like this. We'd start with a clear statement of what's the biggest, most costliest problem that affects the customer. We call it, the key monetizable suffering. And the answer, would be something like you see here. The farmer revenues are 50% lower because they don't have cash to buy fertilizers and high yielding seeds kind of at the front end of the farming season. So the next step is we want to diagnose the root challenge. Like, what is the key factor that we need to address in order to remove that pain and suffering? And the answer would look something like this. The root efficacy challenge really kind of sits in the issue of repayment rates. So, if these customers repay at the very same rates that we would normally see with these kind of subprime customers, the standard interest rate that would have to be charged would completely erode the extra income that they could earn, if they purchased, $200 of seed and fertilizer on the front end. And if we're going to get a compelling amount of extra money, leave a compelling amount of money in that customer's pocket, a big customer ROI, well, we need to create a pretty big improvement. And as you see here, to get $100 extra in someone's pocket, we need to generate like a 50% improvement in these repayment rates. So the next step would be to say, all right, well, what does the science say? Because we've got to find a pathway forward. So remember now, we're also working with that peer group type solution. So we want to know what the science says about driving behavior change in a peer context. And it turns out that, high rates of behavior change happens when peers are kind of in two situations. They're operating in a repeated game context. It's a game theory principle. So they're interacting multiple times. And then secondly, when they have high proximity, and that's a behavioral economics finding that's around, when people know each other well, when they know each other well and have kind of a close relationship, you will see a far greater likelihood of behavior change. So the last step, in this logic train, what we want to do is we want to translate, kind of this general science into a strategy for our specific context and bring it together with the other strategy in again, the most optimal way. So we would end up with something like this, joint liability loans among self-formed peer groups staged in tranches. So that's just a way to kind of almost like re-engineer, kind of backcast how kind of the logic train behind microfinance. And the key point here is I can now probe whether a joint liability loan among self-formed peer groups staged in tranches, actually just makes logical sense, whether it works logically. I can benchmark from other contexts. I can probe it for risks. I can now model this because there are clear activities that you've got to have in place in order for this product idea to work, which means you can now stress test and really evaluate the margin of safety. Okay, we're going to hit a pause here and just do a little bit of a change of pace, clear our minds. We're going to invite in Teodora Burkova. We're going to get back into details around kind of the method, the practice behind it. But I think we've shared a lot of content, and this would be a helpful point in time to have Teodora in. So as I mentioned, Teodora is someone I met when she was working at the global education company Pearson and was leading their initiative to incubate impact ventures in space. And Teodora's background, she's just got this really unique vantage point just about all these kind of perils and pitfalls about building impact ventures. So without further ado, Teodora, if I could ask if you would just kind of first just give an introduction of yourself. And then maybe if I could ask if you would just kind of reflect on what we've been discussing. Just is there anything that you would highlight in particular, either about challenges or opportunities around innovating and catalyzing, if you will, kind of these scalable, impact ventures?
Sure. Yeah, so many. Where to start? Right. So hi everyone. I'm Theodora. Really happy to be here. Thanks, Eric and Patrick, for having me. As Eric mentioned, yeah, we met at Pearson. It was like 10 years ago. I've spent most of my career at the intersection of business, social, and environmental impact. Um, I've worked at the United Nations, then Pearson, and for the last 6 years, I've been with Amazon Web Services, and I head up the go-to-market and solutions team for sustainability. Um, so as Eric mentioned, yeah, I was thinking about challenges and opportunities. I mean, at Pearson, it was kind of a very interesting place to be. For those that are not familiar, it's a large global education company. So at that time, they were doing textbooks, testing, learning software, vocational training, like you name it, they did it. And the scale was massive, but so was the need. We had, and still do have millions of young people out of school, millions more in school, but not really learning much. In the kind of adult education market, even at that time, a shift was emerging, and that trend is now accelerated, driven by the need for new skill sets due to AI driven job displacement and also the climate crisis. So plenty of opportunity to make an impact. And the commercial opportunity was also huge, right? Like when we looked at spending for education, even in lower income markets, it was always one of the sort of top priorities in family budgets. So the issue was though that we were kind of falling in the same trap, which was we would go into these underserved markets and try to basically force fit the business architecture of our established business unit. So kind of like copying and pasting high margin models into a completely different reality. And seeing teams do that several times was where we came up with this idea to launch an internal venture fund that, enabled a different innovation process and a different way to go about this. And that's where we partnered with Eric's firm to do that. One example that I was kind of reflecting on earlier today was we had a team that was looking to reach low-income families in India with after-school learning. So kids were in school, but not really learning very much. So the team thought that, hey, we already have this really, successful learning software that we use in schools in the US. So if we just, tailor the content to make it more culturally appropriate and sort of turn it into a direct to consumer app, families in India will just find it and subscribe to it. And obviously, when we started doing some customer research to understand the problem, we ran into multiple issues, especially around the kind of the value and the cost barriers. So firstly, like 10 years ago, kids at that income level didn't have tablets and families were not able to afford them. So our internal default was to just give them tablets for the pilot, focus on creating efficacious content, and then figure out the sort of hardware problem or this cost barrier later on. But in reality, obviously, we had to solve the hardware access issue from the start and build that into, like, build the workaround into the actual product or service offering. We also learned many kids were already attending after school tutoring sessions in group settings. Okay, so that gave us some ideas about how to overcome the hardware problem. But the second issue is like parents actually like for them, the value wasn't in improved learning outcomes. The value was I have my kids sitting in a tutor session for 2 hours a day, and that in and of itself like counts for, okay, like they're gonna improve their learning outcomes. Um, so would they be, willing to pay more for a tutoring session that now had a tablet with some software on it, right? That like open question, probably not. To them, education meant their kid is sitting in a room with a teacher for 2 hours, even if that tutor, basically just gave out worksheets and then read out the answers. So, this just gives you a sense of like the kind of barriers we would run into with across different sort of learning use cases and with different teams. And it takes us to the other big challenge, which maybe you talked about in the first session around just stakeholder management. The team, after months of research and money spent, knew that the model was broken. But there was already kind of an emotional attachment to the idea, the original idea. And then even the ones that realized they needed to stop trying to replace the tutor, instead maybe start using the tutor as a supervisor and a facilitator of using the software, they couldn't pivot because the investment team back home was still judging them on kind of more standard metrics from the lean and agile methodology. So on the one hand, we had like the chief product officer who was expecting to see KPIs such as, number of experiments ran and number of customers reached with the pilot, so on and so forth. Then we had the CFO who wanted to see like high margin scalable software growth, not something messy, lower margin, hardware and tutor play. Like he was like, wait, now the tutoring mom and pop shop is going to be your paying customer instead of the millions of learners out there who we know need this, these improved learning products. So I think one of the toughest challenges is actually even when the team realizes that the standard approach doesn't work in these settings. If leadership and specifically the funders aren't upskilled to understand these complex markets, to understand these different ways of evaluating and building a venture, they will basically kill the project because it doesn't fit what they expect. So I think one of the lessons learned was like, if we were to do this over again, I think we would pay more attention also to bringing leaders on the journey of this different way of building a venture and how to evaluate it, right? Rather than just on the teams that are executing the work. I'll stop there, Eric. I don't know if you have any follow-up questions. I also was thinking about like how this is playing out today in the climate tech space as well. Still haven't overcome the barriers.
Well, that was Theodore. Thank you. That was absolutely fantastic. You did such a wonderful job of actually reaching back, as you noted, to kind of the issue we raised in the first session. One, just about how even just from a pure like emotional and almost like political standpoint, once you kind of go down the pathway of saying like we're going to go out there, even though you say we're going to pivot, it is really, really tough to do that. And so you get locked in even more, kind of in a certain direction. But it's funny, the thing that was coming to mind to me of the way you're describing it is just this, I guess, if I were to say like almost like the one symptom of someone who's like stuck in this, I'll call it kind of the lean vortex, is this kind of treadmill effect. It's like you're saying, it's like you start down one path, you find one problem, you try to solve it, but you actually just trigger another one. And it's kind of this classic, issue of once you kind of have an architecture that's flawed, like this is what you end up seeing. You change one thing and it's like whack-a-mole, a problem pops up somewhere else. And it kind of gets back to a core thing of like, you can't optimize it. It's already built in kind of the certain cost structure, but that experience of whack-a-mole, I just think it shows up a lot. And maybe to close my reflection on what you said was that, but the funny thing is, it's actually seen as a positive thing, through the lens of lean. It's like,
we're learning.
This is what you should do. You're learning. This is a good thing. And so it's this weird kind of a thing. It's where like the very symptom that you're stuck in a flawed architecture is treated as a positive. Um,
Yeah.
is there anything, and I'm just, because we had a 10-minute delay in starting, we've got about 20 minutes to go of this. I'm going to jump into some of the more kind of the practice, like, so what do we do now? And we're going to talk about some of these structural profit barriers. You are already just highlighting them just beautifully. But if at any point in something I'm going through, I just ask, like, if there's like a Pearson or an Amazon or anything from your prior work at the UN that you feel like would elucidate or kind of bring it to life, please feel free to jump in. And we're going to have a chance again at the end to hopefully circle back and do a little bit more chatting.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Sure.
Thank you so much for that. All right. Well, let's go back into kind of this very last section. And this is about how do we now actually weave together those three principles into a systematic, repeatable practice. And given our particular time constraint we have now, we're just going to dip our toe into the first two steps of this. But even with that, you're going to see how this sets you on just a very different trajectory. So the FIT startup method, the practice itself, still has these two very familiar kind of innovation stages. There's a design stage and there's a prototyping stage. But what's different, is the emphasis. As an engineer would say, we're front loading the process. So we're going to ensure that what gets designed has a really high chance of working before getting into that really costly, time-consuming process of building and validating stuff. And that's why visually, I've made design and validate bigger. So I'm not suggesting it's taking more time than prototyping and validating, quite the contrary. But what's also different is that validation is happening during design itself. It is a central part of the design process. And design and validate has three main steps. So step one is about first just screening the opportunity space. It's about finding the starting point for the venture that can most credibly generate a level of profitability that's necessary to deliver a competitive return on the capital that you need. And we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail shortly. Step two is where we architect the idea. And this is where we're hunting down and circumventing structural profit barriers so that we can boost the venture's robustness. And we're creating this explicit train of logic as we do, for the reasons we discussed. And in the center of this thing, you see the thing called the business architecture logic model. It's a technical name for what's essentially a roadmap that really guides this entire architecting step. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail shortly. And then step three turns to simulation, simulating the core business architecture. And to do this, it goes back to the idea of high fidelity. We use a number of different visual models so that we can literally translate the logic of how a venture works into numbers. And the goal is ultimately to calculate your margin of safety and customer ROI to assess robustness. So if you've designed the venture in this way, the focus on prototyping and validating, it changes from kind of the classic, all right, let's first launch an MVP and just see if we can get product market fit, see if customers like this. Instead, the focus on prototyping and testing what we call a minimum representative pilots, or an MRP instead of your MVP. We're testing here if the venture can perform within those parameters needed to be profitable that's set by your simulation. So you're testing for profitability, not a single point of proof. All right, as I said, we're just going to do a little bit more of probing kind of under the hood of screening and architecting. So first one, the goal of screening, is to isolate what we call the prime commercial opportunity. And what do we mean by that? So the PCO, or the prime commercial opportunity, it is the opportunity space that holds the greatest chance of success, where success again is defined by positive NPV. So it is the best possible starting point for a venture from a perspective of profitability. I've got a very precise technical definition for it, that's here on the screen. So if you're going to start with a new technology, the PCO is the broadest possible use case that can generate these at-scale profits that can generate a competitive return on the capital need. If you're starting from a societal problem, it's the broadest possible impact case that achieves this very same objective around at-scale profits. And we're going to talk about why we start with one or the other in just a sec. It is so key. But just to wrap up on this step, if you go back and you recall Patrick's discussion from part one, he talked about this concept of hill climbing out of computer science. What we're doing here is we're scanning kind of the landscape, if you will, and we're trying to make sure we start on that tallest hill, the one that has the highest potential. So, and in so doing, we're doing two things. We're increasing the probability of success from the start, and we're also eliminating, dead ends. We're avoiding getting trapped on that tiny little hill that ultimately we're going to be forced to pivot from. And the very key concept, that exists kind of in this space is this one of not bounding both sides of the equation from the very start. And both sides meaning the problem side of the equation and the solution side. And as I mentioned in that last time, I almost feel like we're just hardwired to think in this way. We're certainly encouraged by it, with the analog approach to finding ideas, that's popular in lean startup. So the idea of like suddenly, powered lanterns to eliminate, the health and safety hazards of kerosene lantern. Boom, we've got both problem and solution kind of defined in that as the starting point. But when you bound both sides at the very start, you're almost certainly going to land on a little tiny hill. It's going to be very suboptimal because we're either solving the problem suboptimally or suboptimizing the potential of the technology. And I've crafted this very silly but hopefully illustrative example here. So if the problem that we're wanting to solve is digging foundations, clearly it would be ridiculous to start off and say like, I really want to do this using spoons. Because if the goal is to solve this problem, a spoon is just not the best technology to do it. Certainly not the place to start. But similarly, if I was the person who suddenly innovated the spoon and created this new technology, it similarly would be ridiculous to say like, what? I'm committed to figuring out how do we actually dig foundations using the spoon? Because if the goal is to commercialize that novel technology, you want to find problems that best harness and can maximize its unique potential. All right, I'm going to go through and just kind of really quick overview of the process, just to give you a feel again, like what's involved here. So the first thing we do when trying to find the prime commercial opportunity is, we set out initial requirements, financial ones like what's the target IRR or the hurdle rate, and what's the investment period? How much time do I have to kind of get this return? And then what are my scope requirements from a geography and industry relevance perspective? And it's at that point, now you branch off into one of these two ways. Either you go the novel technology route or what we call the pervasive societal problem. So if you're going the novel technology route, the first thing you do, we say like, all right, sit back and what is the core functionality that it actually possesses? And what are those unique attributes from that? We use that as a lens for then defining and identifying just broad use cases where that is kind of those attributes are best kind of utilized. And then we actually run numbers to figure out what kind of price would be needed for each use case to generate that competitive return on capital. And then we evaluate that number against the use case and say like, are these credible? And I'm going to give you an example of one that we, just to kind of, again, bring this to life. So we had an opportunity to advise, there's a startup behind, it's called Kite Mill Technology. So it is this new technology. Amazon themselves, had a play in this, I believe. It's a new technology. It generates energy, but it uses these high altitude kites. They look like drones, and they're tethered to a generator on ground. And so, after going through their financial and scope requirements, we talked with them, through kind of like, well, what's the functionality behind this technology? What does it do? How does it work? Just at its most basic level. And this is where we landed. We then kind of use that to pull out what are some of these key attributes that kind of emerge from this core functionality. And this is what we kind of crafted. Like, all right, so you get really stable, consistent energy at those high altitudes. It's green energy. The output that you get here could power 70 homes. The nature of this is just it's highly mobile. And then we put some, then we used kind of this as the lens to say like, all right, what are these broad use cases where these types of attributes kind of make the most sense? And we use as a brainstorming guide, kind of these three, like what is there in the B2B space, in business to consumer, business to government? And you see here kind of examples of what was come up with. The last thing we do is that we then kind of go through and we calculate what we said again are these, what would the required price be? And I'm going to just pull over here. We created we've got a little template calculator that we've created. I think it's available on our website. And this, again, just to bring it to life of the idea of like, for each of the use cases, we could go through. And again, there's some very, very easy ways to back envelope your way from starting with the size of like, how big is the group of people in that use case, getting down to what would be kind of like the average annual price you'd have to charge in order to cover the amount of capital that developing a solution kind of in this use case would approximately require. Again, this is all weather vane. This is just to kind of it's a compass. We don't need precision here. But you see kind of at the end, you actually kind of get some numbers to work with that to help now guide and sense check whether or not like the urgency level that each of these use cases present. If we look at, at similar urgency cases, use cases with similar urgency, like how do they stack up in terms of like, prices people pay, the value that people see in them? So let me remove this guy from here. So the key takeaway here is that we're starting the very design and architecting process with an opportunity space that's already been sense checked using an NPV lens. And step two, this central one of architecting a robust core business architecture. And just because we call it architecting, rather than designing here, just because like an architect, like this step really combines a lot of just rigor and discipline. Like you have to understand how things work and have but at the same time, there's a big space of creativity that's involved. Just to be clear, what we mean by a robust core business architecture. So we've talked a lot about what's a core business architecture. This is, again, the bundle of strategies that perform kind of the basic functions essential to commercial viability of the market, not any single company. And as Patrick was saying, like, think of it as the DNA that ends up being shared by all the competitors' business models. But a business architecture is made robust when those bundle of strategies do two things. One, they actually solve all the structural barriers that are embedded in those basic commercial functions that it performs. And two, we bring those strategies together in the proverbial quote synergistic way. But we want to bring them together into a shape, a product idea that just creates big economies in operation. So the proverbial 2 + 2 = 8. So we can solve 8 profit barriers with just 4 parts. And the key concept, that's behind this step is that of productizing strategies. So the way you create synergies in a core business architecture is by shaping the product idea itself. We use the term a product form factor to channel those strategies you develop to get around, the structural profit barriers. And it's by shaping the product to solve those barriers that you reduce pressure on the operational model. The way I would describe it, you make it easy, to make, sell, deliver, and get paid for and repeat sell the product. And it's in that move that you end up deleting big chunks of work, which then ends up deleting a bunch of resourcing. And I like the word deleting a lot. And it's part of, if Elon Musk has this, it's become quite famous, his innovation algorithm, because it's central to how he approaches the innovation process. But it's this deleting big chunks of work that we get big jumps in cost, in that cost to value ratio. And again, that was what was going on in that microfinance example that I gave earlier. They got around due diligence by turning what was a small business loan into a peer group loan. So the product idea itself is channeling that peer support in peer pressure workaround strategy. And in so doing, they're eliminating a whole bunch of business model activities and costs. And it's actually not a crazy idea, but the idea of shaping the product to create operational gains, it's already done today. It's just we do it typically I would call it end of pipe when we're optimizing, kind of at the end of the product and business model. So I mean, there's a whole subfields in this, like there's like design for logistics, where you take the product and you say, all right, well, what do we do to make it easy to ship and handle? So we were going to have a square milk carton so that we maximize the container space. It's just in this case, we're just applying this concept to just the very inception of the product idea itself. All right, now to one final key little piece here. So one of our, I would call it kind of the biggest contributions to the science of robust venture innovation is in the form of a venture roadmap. We call it the business architecture logic model. There's that thing in the center. So this is a simplified visual of the logic model, and it captures the way you work through that, the model. So it distills out 9 structural profit barriers that are embedded in 3 first principle, those basic functions that establish the viability of every new market. So unless, and you see them here, catalyze value surplus, normalize customer routine, and dictate competitive landscape. Again, touch on them briefly here in a sec. Patrick will actually talk about in a little more detail an example. These 3, are consistent. I don't care what industry or market in, because these are first principle functions that every commercial venture has to solve for. Now, the strategies that you develop, as you're going through kind of our spiral here, they are productized as you go through. So you're reconceiving kind of this product form factor in the center after every structural profit barrier is solved. Taking into consideration what you developed before. Again, that was the example that we walked through with microfinance. So this simplified visual doesn't show one thing, and that's there behind in the logic model. There's actually like a 4-step solution pathway for each one of these profit barriers. So you end up with a mind-blowing grid of 36 boxes, which is why I'm not going to show it. I have in the past, unfortunately, for those previous viewers. But these pathways are what literally just guides you to finding and circumventing those profit barriers. So you're building up a testable train of logic. And in the example I gave for microfinance, about a testable logic, I was actually walking through that pathway. So like terms like, what's the key monetizable customer suffering? What's the efficacy parameter? What's your efficacy theory of change? So for our purpose today, I just want to do a brief overview of the functions and these 9 structural profit barriers that are under each. And then Patrick, I'll hand over to Patrick for the case. So catalyze value surplus, kind of the very first of our functions. This is the foundation of a venture's architecture, because what we're doing here is we're creating conditions for market viability. And what I mean by that is that what customers get from the solution is going to inherently be worth more than what it costs to deliver it. So it's here that we really think of it as the relative heights of cost and value curves. And the 3 profit barriers that you just have to circumvent or eliminate are the ones that you see here. So the first one, circumvent critical cost driver, it's targeting the operation in that default architecture that's going to disproportionately or otherwise drive up cost, which is going to set that threshold that exceeds the value customers get. So due diligence in our microfinance example. And the second one, we're looking for where is there the biggest monetizable suffering and pain, if you will, that we can free customers of. In the microfinance case, it was removing the barrier that prevented smallholder farmers from making an extra, $500 of revenue for every acre. And this is the structural profit barrier that sets the value for the ceiling, the ceiling for the value curve. And in this third one, we're targeting a barrier that otherwise just invariably locks ventures out of, I picture it as there's these social, informational, and resource networks that customers just are currently inhabiting for all their current needs and the stuff that they're buying, using. But if you stay locked out of this, the cost of reaching and engaging, converting customers, getting solutions to them, it will skyrocket. But there is a barrier invariably to getting into those networks. Normalizing customer routine, and normalizing the customer routine, kind of the second function here. Think of it, this is here, we're trying to make it easy for customers to essentially adopt what is just literally a brand new product, in many cases, just brand new functionality for them. because it is literally unavoidable that with any new market, the customer is going to have to figure out how to integrate this product into their lives, which, as Teodora was already giving us some examples in the Pearson case, is no small feat. And the three structural profit barriers we call here kind of a customer want block, a use block, and a buy block. And they're each addressing a different aspect of the normalization process of a product into somebody's life. So the want block, it deals with the problem that whenever someone's presented with a new to world solution, they just don't see the product's value. Teodora, the example that you gave about moving from tutors, insight to suddenly, oh, here's a tablet with a software tablet.
We're like, we'll just do really good marketing, and then they'll know.
Exactly. We'll just convince them and keep telling. We'll give them that really crisp, USP, and suddenly that they're just going to open their eyes to it. But the whole thing is like they're so conditioned to living kind of with the suffering, that otherwise could be released through this kind of the potential that's in this new solution, but they just don't even realize they have a problem because they've been thinking about value in a very different way. So the focus here is on finding and circumventing kind of the source of that blinder. The use block here, then deals with the problem that, every of these new products, it requires learning a new product routine. There's a lot of behavioral and social stuff that comes with that, and it's uncomfortable. And so here we're trying to find where's that one routine of behavior that is particularly problematic, because you could almost always isolate something fundamental is really kind of standing between kind of the learning and adopting of a new routine that literally kind of turns people off from even trying. So it's almost like in the food space, like one of the things that becomes incredibly hard, when you're dealing with nutritional issues is like getting somebody to eat, a new fortified foods like 3 or 4 times a week so that they actually ingest enough of micronutrients or macronutrients that you actually get the nutritional benefit. And then ultimately the buy block, it deals with the problem that, again, these new to world products, it's all new spend for somebody. Customers don't have any money budgeted for this. And the focus here is on removing that block and aligning kind of the timing of payment of money kind of going out with the timing of value created by the solution. Before I just jump to the next one, Teodora, is there something that you feel like here again that maybe resonated or that, like you said, we already kind of referenced one of the things you brought up, but anything else here that you feel like popped into your mind?
Yeah, I mean, just how people pay for things is very different, obviously depending on the setting. So I know there's a pretty famous, like at Amazon when they were scaling across India again, the way that the payments had to happen had to look very different, meaning people didn't have like an Amazon account. They didn't feel comfortable paying for something before they got the product. There were kind of a series of little barriers just around how the payment would be made. So in the end, they ended up leveraging like these small mom and pop stands that every village has, where the products would get shipped and they would actually do the money exchange on behalf of Amazon, because it just otherwise wasn't working when we first started out there. So I think that's another area. Is just like, how do you get paid for this? Don't assume that it's going to translate.
Exactly. All right. And just to wrap up with kind of this last one, dictate competitive landscape. So here, what we're focused on is like, ultimately, you have to construct a market where the competitive dynamics stays profitable over time. So it's not just about kind of at launch, can we keep competitors out? But for that to happen, there's got to be stability in terms of kind of customers, competitors, and suppliers that literally kind of insulates, your profitability. So the first profit barrier under this function, it deals with these high costs that are created when customers can just move in and out of competitive products. And so the focus here is on creating a pool of value that customers lose or give up when they switch. So, I mean, it's like, think about the impacts of of losing all the previous versions of your work if you're going to switch from one software to another. The second one here is about eliminating what we call kind of the competitor race to the bottom. And it's about addressing kind of the incredibly destructive force of having to compete on price. Because the focus here ends up being on how do we manufacture, I'll call it a state of scarcity, kind of, or to use the strategy term, inimitability, around some kind of a resource that's central to the value proposition. And the final one here is just focused on supplier, just eliminating the profit barrier that comes from being trapped in a high dependency relationship to somebody, to any supplier who's got a key input for you. And the focus here is on manufacturing what we call a state of replaceability for any of these critical inputs. And I think Apple's App Store just really brilliantly addresses these last two. They elevated the importance of developing just a wide and steady stream of new apps as really the key determinant and driver of a phone's value, smartphone's value, which made it hard for companies to enter the market without gaining wide support now from the community of app developers, but for their specific phone. But at the same time, they reduced Apple's dependency on any one app developer, which could have otherwise extracted just a lot of value from Apple. All right, I know we're a little bit over time already. I'm going to hand over to Patrick here. My apologies, we started late. I think we would have been okay. Patrick, could I ask you to kind of come in and take us down the home stretch here with the case study?
Sure. So we decided to turn a little bit from building a venture to diagnosing a live venture. This is something you can actually take away from this presentation and start using yourself. Start looking at some of the key questions that Eric raised, and look at how does the venture you're looking at answer them? Do they answer them? Or are they even addressing it? And very often, if they're not structurally addressing one of these key profit barriers, it means a profit barrier still exists, and therefore the cost of the venture is still really high. So again, when you're trying to get into a new market, you think about some of those metrics that Eric mentioned earlier about how big of a financial margin of safety you want, how big of a customer ROI you want. You'll find those are really if the profit barriers are not addressed by the venture, they're going to be facing them. They're going to have really low margins of safety and low customer ROI, which is going to cause issues for the company over time. Why don't you go ahead? So we're going to use a case study of this is a food science nutrition venture that we came across in working with investors. Is also this company has publicly shared their pitch materials as well. I won't name them. But they were a company that had some really promising traction. Their founders were really strong, PhD food scientists from a top university with a novel IP and formulation for nutritious food. Not only just nutritious food, but like in a tasty form factor. They had been able to acquire a lot of patient funding. They had almost $2 million in grants that funded validation of the science and retail pilots. They'd landed on a B2B model that was essentially like creating private labels for retailers that seemed to help them sidestep the brutal economics of building their own brand. Actually, one of the reasons why they ended up in the B2B model, because they did try to build their own brand and found just how difficult it was to change people's behaviors and to raise awareness of their product. They had some initial retail traction. So they had these high nutrition products that were on the shelves of several major retailers already. There's a bunch of positive signals around it, the space overall. There's like a lot of growth in private labels at retailers, and there's a growing demand for better for you products as a category. Go ahead. We start looking at the architecture. We're going to start looking at that first function that Eric talked about, the first three principles. And what we find is that under this analysis, that they're really squeezing their margins. They're not addressing some of the profit barriers head on or in a structural manner, in which case, the margins get squeezed, and they're really only creating a modest value for their customers, in which case this is retailers. Go ahead to the next one. And so in terms of circumventing the critical cost driver they identified was consumer behavior change. It's hard to get consumers to adopt the behavior necessary to buy these nutritious products. And the other part was standing up manufacturing. Manufacturing of food products extremely expensive. Set it up in a scalable way. It's a big investment of CapEx. And so they decided, let's sidestep this. And the way we're going to do this is we're gonna set up relations. We're gonna private label for retailers, and we're gonna manage relationships with manufacturers and co-packers. So what this did though was it didn't really circumvent the cost driver. It just pushed it somewhere else. It outsourced to retailers and co-packers at a cost to their own margins. And so the margins they could command because they were in the middle, it came down to, it looked like capital efficiency, but it was actually just margin compression by design. And so they came down to like 18 to 32% gross margins in a business where, the co-packers end up holding the physical asset, the retailer holds the shell. So it was just reassigned to parties who now had leverage over the venture. So not a good circumvention strategy. Go to the next one. So eliminating the customer's value bottleneck. So the value bottleneck that you can identify is that retailers lack R&D capabilities to come up with this better for you products. And as a result, they're missing out on category growth. Now here, the loss is real, but it was primarily really a stress loss because other options did exist already. There were a lot of there's consultants, there's other food manufacturers, there's other research firms that they could have worked with. So the value they hear, like there was a loss that was addressed, but there were a lot of other people that were able to address it already. So the actual loss they were able to address was actually somewhat limited. Go on to the next one. And so, circumventing the customer gateway barrier, the big gateway that they identified was reliance on trade shows, and they decided to do this. They decided there's no circumvention strategy here. There's no structural improvement. They just hustled. They went to trade shows. They put the product in front of customers. They went through the expensive sales cycle and landed some customers. But they were alongside everybody else who was also doing that in the same space. And so they had no structural advantage here. Go ahead. Yep. And so the next level, what we find is their solutions started increasing cost. Open this one. So in terms of the customer want block, the want block is they don't, the retailers don't know that this works. And so it's going to be, the big thing is essentially that's blocking it is demonstration capabilities. And so, we're going to just demonstrate it again at trade shows, other places where you can get meetings. And, it worked in the sense that when they got in front of people, they were able to, over time demonstrate the efficacy of the product, the value of the product. Was extremely intensive sales driven effort. There's no strategy or mechanism to make the value self-evident. So it was not that dissimilar to what a consulting company would have to do in terms of landing work. It was a lot of boots on the ground type of efforts, which again increases cost. In terms of circumventing the customer use block, it's essentially that the use block. Why weren't retailers already doing this? Is like, well, R&D, is a capability we want to have. And operational complexity for running this was really high for a retailer. And so the turnkey value that the company created for retailers was real, but the way they did that was by increasing their own cost structure, and then also the dependency on the third-party co-packers, the third-party manufacturers who essentially increased the leverage they had over the venture itself. Go ahead. And then, the buy block. What they ended up doing was trying to deal with this was by positioning it as going after existing private label product budgets, which did exist, which is good. There's money there to be spent, but the competition for those budgets already existed, and sometimes was extremely fierce. They picked a category or tried to compete in a category that already existed instead of creating a new one. Go ahead. So coming into the home stretch here, the solutions they had also increased their existential risk. So in terms of limiting customer gaming, the big thing that they had to deal with was avoid retailers going around them to co-packers, other manufacturers. This again is a critical vulnerability of the company. This was largely a transactional relationship, and they remained a high risk of retailers to go around the venture. Once the co-packer started essentially sourcing products through the venture to the retailer, the amount of margins that the venture was able to command was increasingly under pressure as they had to make sure the value was high enough. But in the meanwhile, they were essentially a glorified middleman. and who could have been worked around. Um, Eliminating the competitor race to the bottom. The main thing that they tried to use here was like, look, our food science is gonna hold up our margins. It's gonna be food science is gonna hold up the margins in the market. It's not just anything that anybody can copy. People actually have to invest in it. The efficacy of the IP is like really uncertain that they had. And if you study food categories, this is particularly true. IP doesn't tend to hold up into a long-term sustainable advantage. Um, and the current margins that are already starting to charge didn't have enough room in them to be able to absorb a loss to this value. And so this put them on shaky ground. And finally, like this is the biggest, one for them is like eliminating the supplier stranglehold. They really needed to establish a Goldilocks zone of co-packer expertise. They need co-packers that, if they end up with co-packers that couldn't reliably execute the special process that they needed to create these products, meaning they couldn't develop the expertise to do it, then the venture costs increased because they had to spend more time with the co-packers. Bringing in more co-packers became more expensive because you constantly had to be hand-holding and teaching them. On the other end, though, if the co-packers gain too much expertise in these processes, like the venture risk disintermediation, the co-packers go around them, other people could copy it. It really placed them in a difficult zone to try to work at to avoid a supplier stranglehold. And so, in summary, like in reality, the venture made a bunch of moves that on the surface look very elegant. When you look at it from an architectural lens, it's really they just relocated the hard problems. They didn't remove them, or what we call squeezing the balloon. If you can imagine that, the air just goes somewhere else, but the air is still in the balloon. So the consumer adoption was offloaded to retailers. So they avoided the expensive brand building, but there's a cost to the margin, and they gave leverage to the retailer. They moved manufacturing complexity off to the co-packers. And so, but the co-packers end up controlling execution, quality, and capacity. And they had the potential to build up formula knowledge and be able to just move around or how to do it and just move around the venture itself. And the operational complexity moved to a party that the venture essentially couldn't control. So a key part of the value proposition they delivered, they couldn't control it anymore. And lastly, just touching on the grant funding and the patient capital that they received. Yeah, it funded R&D and retail pilots, but the initial fundraising requirements were kept low, but the strings attached was the type of funding that they got, including publication requirements and ways of essentially exposing some of their secret sauce to the world, which again causing issues in their ability to dictate the competitive landscape. And they also just didn't represent or cause them to build a repeatable the capacity to generate the funds they needed to operate or scale the business. It wasn't something that it was replicable after the initial stage. Yeah, so that's the end of the analysis of this company. Again, these folks, very smart people are working really hard. The problem was again, these standard methodologies, you're not asking the right questions. You're not focused on the key problems that you need to solve for, and that is these core profit barriers that we brought up. These 9 requirements, or what's called 9 principles that you need to solve for. And what happens when you're not solving for them is you end up solving for something else. And when you solve for something else, it's much harder to later come back and try to fix something that you've already broken. Go ahead, Eric. I think that is. Thank you for bearing with us. Eric, do you want to wrap up?
If you're interested in learning more, we got a few things that are happening. One, if you're in the energy space and are interested, like we're actually looking for sponsors of energy focused problems. So we have a partnership, or I guess a grant kind of through NYSERDA, which is kind of the New York State Energy. I should know this. Anyhow, but in the fall, we're going to be taking engineering grad students through a robust venture design course, going through these structural profit barriers, applying it, or solving these structural profit barriers, applying it to energy related technologies or energy related problems. And the way we're structuring it is that we would have actual companies identifying areas that they're interested in, technology problem spaces. And there'd be an opportunity actually for the people from those companies to essentially kind of sit in and kind of be part of that design process. So it would give them almost like a bird's eye view. You'd be kind of in the kitchen where we do these design reviews. So there'd be a real opportunity to get some exposure to the methodology. And at the same time, you'd be able to see what this methodology could deliver. And these other two things are ways to get kind of introduced to the methodology. The first one, we're picking a time to do a workshop, being a 2.5-day stretch, where we would essentially take you through I would call it kind of a quick architecting process, to go through the basic principles of architecting, and then kind of specifically understand kind of how you go about solving for and thinking about these structural profit barriers, and then how you actually bring them together into what we've been calling kind of this robust idea.
Eric touched on this. He didn't show them, but there are strategies, there are tools that you can use to come up with solutions to these profit barriers. And that's part of what we would take you through in working on an actual architecture of a venture.
Exactly. Thank you for that. But there, the focus is on, it's less on you're going to come out of it with like, I've got a venture that I moved along, but it's really, you'd be taking something, an idea that you have, or something you want to look at as a starting point, but it's really more to give you just exposure to kind of these tools and the practice. Whereas the venture training studio that we're looking to launch in this, I guess the cohort we're looking to do is probably in a June start. We just haven't gotten our calendar set on this one, is to actually take teams through, and these can be teams within corporates. We're also looking at a version that's going to have entrepreneur teams paired with an investor cohort, where you're actually going to be taking kind of your idea, and we'll guide you through, very similar to what the students are going through kind of in a very structured course, to go through all the profit barriers, applying the sets of tools, so that you'll come out of it actually with a fully architected, we call it a venture blueprint, a fully architected venture that kind of is at the point of that next level of moving in over to prototype. Dates for these just haven't been set right now. But if you're interested in any of these, just let me know. And even from a location wise, we're looking at 2 different places right now, either Cornell campus in New York City, which is the most likely one just because of ease of access, or we would do it here in Ithaca, where I am.
There were some questions about whether or not we'd support, remote. It's something we can still discuss and see how it works. Obviously, there's a lot of benefit to being in person, but we're still getting interest on it, so trying to see what the balance of interest on in terms of in person and remote framing would be.
It's important. The 12-week one is obviously a combination of face remote and face-to-face. A lot of the sessions we have a kickoff session, and we do remote. There's a mid studio design review. We're back face-to-face, and then we're again remote until the very end. But yeah, drop us a line if any of these things are interested. We can get you some more information on them. And we're also cooking up another webinar, and that is to spend a little bit more time on this whole way of like, how do you use this way just to evaluate commercial viability? Again, this is coming out of the work that we're doing with the MIT Alumni Angels Network. So we'll be kind of sharing some of actually kind of tools and ways of kind of guiding the thinking process that Patrick was summarizing.
It's also building on work that Eric did for Shell Foundation, IFC, and others, where brought in to use essentially fit to evaluate the commercial viability of let's say very large scale impact ventures that you probably all heard of. But we can go into more detail in this session.
Okay, everyone. Well, I appreciate for those who hung on and let us carry on over time. And yeah, just really thank you. Please reach out if anything. If there's any of these comments that are left that we can, we'll circle back with on. We'll share the video of this as well as a summary as we did last time. But otherwise, looking forward to staying in touch with everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Teodora, for joining us.
Yes, absolutely. I neglect that. Teodora, thank you so much for doing this. Teodora is in.
My pleasure.
This is tipped into your evening, so appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone.